LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is sociologist Harvey Molotch, author of Against Security: How We Go Wrong at Airports, Subways and Other Sites of Ambiguous Danger. Remember when an unattended package was just that? An unattended package? Remember when the airport was a place that evoked magical possibilities, not the anxiety of a full body scan? In the post-9/11 world, we have become focused on heightened security measures, but do you feel safer? And are you safer? Against Security explains how our anxieties about public safety have translated into command and control procedures that annoy, intimidate, and are often counterproductive. Taking readers through varied ambiguously dangerous sites, Molotch argues that we can use our existing social relationships to make life safer and more humane. Throughout, he offers thoughtful ways of maintaining security that are not only strategic but improve the quality of life for everyone. Against Security argues that with changed policies and attitudes, redesigned equipment, and an increased reliance on our human capacity to help one another, we can be safer and maintain the pleasure and dignity of our daily lives. Hello and welcome, Harvey Molotch, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Great to be with you.
Now, Harvey, today we're going to discuss your book, Against Security: How We Go Wrong at Airports, Subways and Other Sites of Ambiguous Danger. Perhaps you could just get us started by giving us just an overview of the book itself.
Well, the book examines the security issue from the standpoint of mostly the everyday. So the kinds of barriers we run into, the turnstiles, the messages we receive, to be careful, to be aware, to keep our eye on things, the sort of stops we encounter. And the larger issue is how it is that anxiety, which is always in the air because of the fact that we're all going to die for one thing, but there are events that are terror, like 9/11 being the most extreme for Americans, that intrude on our consciousness. And the question is, what do we do about it? And there's a kind of implementation which can go in all kinds of ways, and it does in different countries at different times. And those ways don't make sense. And sometimes the precautions taken against danger, against terror, for example, or catastrophe, make us less safe rather than more safe. And this book is a kind of brass tacks, down to earth, how it happens and how it goes wrong, and what we could do to make it better and make it less go wrong.
Now, of course, in the modern era, throughout the 20th century, there was always security checkpoints, and in public places there would be security guards, various measures taken to prevent mishaps and accidents. Most of them quite sensible, really, or coming from a place that was quite logical. But then something changed at some point, and for me personally, and I think for a lot of other people, you mentioned 9/11, I don't remember really thinking about security prior to 9/11. Now, I grew up in Northern Ireland, which was a really quite violent place throughout the 70s and most of the 80s. The security there was very obvious and for very obvious reasons, but the security that I experienced growing up actually feels, thinking back, less obtrusive than what we have now, which sounds bizarre. And so for me, 9/11, from that point on, something really changed.
That's very instructive to me, because I know, of course, about the Irish situation, the rebellion, the deaths, the opposition, the English response, but the idea that you would find today's security apparatus more intrusive is interesting to me, and quite dramatic, actually, given that it again shows that the different ways that different cultures at different times respond to threat.
Now, 9/11, of course, was a huge event, if not necessarily in numbers of lives lost, which, of course, 3,000 or something is tragic. But in the global scale of loss of life, it wasn't huge. But it was huge in the popular consciousness and in the media, of course, and because it happened to the US and the type of people that it happened to, all those sorts of reasons. So what is it about 9/11 really that was it just the things that I've just mentioned that made it sort of unique of its kind and the response to it so, well, for want of a better word, draconian?
So I think that 9/11 did have some theatrical aspects, and so much of the security apparatus is about theater. So it's plausible to start with the setting of the theater. 9/11 was made for TV movie. First of all, the nightmare of an airplane crash. We've long known this. People are much more afraid of airplanes than they are of bathtubs, and bathtubs are much more dangerous than airplanes. So nightmares happen with airplanes, and then skyscrapers. And a conflagration at the top of a skyscraper is, again, everybody's nightmare. Now, you add in the fact that this is the United States of America, world's most powerful, yada, yada country on earth, and don't tread on me, and nobody mucks with us, and the fact that the U.S. has been, ever since the Civil War, secure against any kind of military assault, makes this a very dramatic event as well. And yes, the whole world responds to the U.S. nightmares, in part because the U.S. puts its nightmares out on mass media and creates the world's, or at least a genre of the world's nightmares in the first place. And the U.S. also, in very concrete ways, influences the security apparatuses that are in place in the world. Because, for example, with airplanes, the U.S. between the U.S. FAA and the fact that so many aircraft are made in the United States means that the infrastructure of the whole world when it comes to air travel gets dominated by the U.S. They are U.S. rules, U.S. standards. And for a plane to be able to land in the U.S., it must correspond to those protocols, those standards. And so, therefore, all the airlines of the world and the other plane manufacturers in the world, of which there are very few, conform to the U.S. standard.
A lot of this overall, not just airport security, but you've various chapters in your book break down different security arenas, and a lot of it comes from the need to do something or to be seen to be doing something in the face of particular threats. And of course, after 9/11, it was obvious that something had to be done. I remember on the day it happened in the afternoon talking to some people and saying what the US needs to do now is nothing. They just need to wait and see, just wait. You know, if someone runs up to you in the street and punches you in the face, you know, you might want to retaliate immediately. But if it happened to me, I'd say, hang on a minute, why did that person punch me in the face? And you point out not only this a lot of security stemming from this need to do something, but it's also behind that is the fact that a lot of security apparatus and governments and what have you, they don't actually know what to do.
Right. They don't know what to do. And again, that's not very unique either. A whole lot of things happen to us in the world, and we don't know how it occurred, and we don't know what to do. And there's a very strong human inclination to indeed do something. And how that inclination to do something gets transmuted into specific actions, I think depends on the historic setting and the kind of country that you're dealing with and who's in power. So at the moment of 9/11, I thought, and I was living in New York at the time and watched the towers fall, and I was utterly bewildered, especially initially because we had no idea of how this was all unfolding. My inclination was to think, well, now it shows that the U.S. really is interdependent with the rest of the world. When we learned that, in this case, Saudis were involved with Afghanistan as a base and all that, and that surely now American policy would be oriented in a global way, in a peaceful way, and somehow trying to deliver dignity and incorporation and inclusion to all these peoples of the world. And I was just completely, there's the phrase, dead wrong. And the U.S. took the absolute opposite perspective. And I think that's the sort of example of a switch point in history, that George Bush was president of the United States. Another Republican, a right-wing Republican, Giuliani, was the mayor of New York. Another Republican was governor of New York, Pataki. And between them, but especially George Bush, they translated this event into an opportunity and indeed a compulsion for revenge. And revenge is always on the checklist of one of the possible responses. And patience is another. Peace is still another. And they ticked off the revenge button. And as a result of that, compared to the 3,000 people who died on 9/11, we had thousands more than that of American troops that have died since that revenge button was pressed. And of course, well over 100,000 people of civilians, far and away innocent civilians in the Middle East lost their lives.
Well, with regard in particular to threat of terrorism, and we understand that not all terrorists call themselves terrorists. You know, there are grey areas and different definitions there. That in the experience of Ireland, you can't just keep crushing threats, because then it's just a war of attrition, which everyone ends up losing, and you eventually have to compromise. That is the only way to actually resolve these situations. It's a bit like, I can't remember what comedy show it was on. Someone was joking about they were, I think it was someone in power, like a king perceiving threats everywhere, and one of his advisors said, "You need to kill everyone else in the entire world, and then you'll be safe."
Yeah, that's the extreme solution, is to just be alone, and then of course you'll die of loneliness, which is an actual medical condition that's very, very common. I feel that if you don't know what to do, and September 11th is one of those circumstances in which, I have my orientation of the world, but I really can't prove that it's true, and that if we were patient and engaged people, that we would win their hearts and minds, that we could do actual things that to win their hearts and minds. I don't know that that's true, but I think it's better to operate on that assumption. If you don't know what you're doing, you might as well be decent. And that's a kind of theme of my book. I call it the default to decency. Mm-hmm. If the situation is utterly ambiguous, and in many of these circumstances, they are circumstances of ambiguity, then do some affirmative action for decency. And so, I think rock and roll is decent. And I think we should, the British and the Americans own global rock and roll. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think it's a wonderful enticement for the world. Never mind also things like medical care and educational attainment. And there's all sorts of positive things to be doing. And if you, like I said, I can't prove those will work magic. But if you don't know what you're doing, you might as well do something that's decent. And maybe it will work.
In terms of psychology, to what extent do you think this is connected to a certain human craving for certainty? I mean, even though life and nature shows us that chaos reigns and that there's nothing but uncertainty, we do kind of want the jury to be in, don't we? We want things to be settled, to know what we've got, even if it's limited, so everything's predictable.
Yeah, no, I think that there is a very deep human orientation of the world that creates a thirst for clarity and for certainty and for the ability to act along the lines of that certainty. And without focusing on a kind of existential crisis, it's indeed something that haunts all our lives, that the whole thing actually is chaos and craziness. And that there is no certainty to anything, not even the reality outside of our own bodies is necessarily certain at all. There's all sorts of terrible threats of absurdity that surround us. And so we really do yearn for some kinds of solidity through which we can make our lives. And so we're really sitting ducks for something like an attack on 9/11 or the claim that there are witches who are brewing all sorts of horrible things that are going to come our way. And explaining, which lots of people have done on the world, when calamities do occur, for example, diseases, that they're due to some horrible human beings who are stirring up the pot, stirring up the brew of evil. And peoples, not just contemporary Americans, but we're peoples in the history of the world are susceptible to that kind of way of getting out of their ambiguity, and especially ambiguous danger, which again is a term I use a lot in the book. It's all about the ambiguous danger and the effort to deal with it.
And at a more mundane level, a lot of the security apparatus is introduced against, or in this culture we have, which is very risk-averse. This is the culture where anonymous woman sues McDonald's because she buys a cup of coffee, gets into her car, the driving seat, has the coffee in her lap, it falls over, she gets burned, so she sues McDonald's, or where you routinely now see bags of nuts with caution may contain nuts on them.
Right. Well, that's also the litigation systems, at least in the U.S., work their wonders in very specific ways that create these circumstances. In the book, what I try to point out is the way in which some of these are fairly nutty. There's the word nutty again, in the negative sense. So maybe that's the sense I do mean it in. So if we go back to the airports again, the risk aversion, which causes these searches for all of us before we get on a plane. Even recently, I was on a plane that only held 10 people, and they took us through the whole business, of course, as though there were 400 people getting on the plane. One of the things that people, I don't know if they notice or not, but that often the number of people waiting to go through airport security, all gathered up in a crowd, is larger than the number of people who will ever be on an airplane. So the phrase security theater has been used because none of those people have been checked at all. And the security apparatus has actually gathered up the target itself. The first gathering up happens at check-in, which are often, we've all been on those scenes. There are more people trying to check in. They have not been checked at all as they try to check in. And there they are, this large crowd. Then the next big crowd is at the security gate itself, and no one has been checked. And the only thing that makes that plausible is this narrative that, again, a theatrical scenario that terrorists only blow up planes. They don't do other things that would impose terror. And we know in places where there really is terror, or there has been, for example, Israel or Algeria, terrorists do not specialize narrowly. They figure out all kinds of settings in which they can do mayhem. In the Irish case, again, that was also the instance. I mean, blowing up the Hilton Hotel. They didn't wait for a flight to do terror. And the fact that we have these, I mean, to call it gaping hole is to understate the case. But the example I gave of the airport security gate itself being the creating a potential target as part of the very apparatus guarding against terror. I think that's the giveaway.
In the book you speak of your phrase, I think, is the irrationality of risk judgment, which basically goes back to something we were saying earlier about your bathtubs analogy, where the bathtub you're more likely to fall over and injure yourself or perhaps even die as a result of your injuries than you are to come to grief in a plane. Similarly, you're much more likely to die crossing the road than you are taking a flight, whether there's any terrorists on there or not. In fact, you're more likely to bring nuts up again, or rather to, well, figuratively and literally, you're more likely to choke on a peanut than you are to die as a result of a terroristic act. But I think a lot of people are not familiar with the raw numbers on risks. And actually, even if you put them before them, they tend to still have this, as you say, that the mental image, the nightmare image, almost outweighs any statistics that you can bring up.
Yes, I think that's true. And that's us. I think that is deeply human, and to do that. But that often another kind of set of reasoning comes into play. And so therefore you can have these differences that we've seen in the world. So when the trains were blown up in Spain, then the Spanish government responded by pulling its troops out of the Iraq War. Something like that happens in the United States, and the response is to increase the militaristic response. There's all these different ways of doing it. I also see variations in the way localities within the United States impose security, for example, at the airports. So in some airports, the TSA regime, as guided by the employees, is quite militaristic, and I think that's exactly the right term to use. The whole thing is militaristic. That is, everyone has to go through exactly the same procedures. They're told to exactly do the same things. They do the same things. We do know that the British and the Americans seem to be the most militaristic. When I am in some small towns in the United States, the people at the security gates are almost apologetic. They're a little bit charming. They might even be a little bit helpful. They never touch your things in a helpful way. They never touch your body in a helpful way. They never help you lift something off, for example, to put it on the platform. But I'm getting back to the U.S. and Britain. The business of taking off your belt, taking off your shoes, making sure your laptop is out of the bag, despite efforts to globally standardize that, they're not quite standardized. And the U.S. and Britain are the most extreme. And that displays, again, the way in which there is some sort of local give in the way in which the implementation occurs to what is supposedly the same threat around the world.
Yeah, so you mentioned there about airport staff and helpfulness or lack thereof. And I had an interesting contrast in a couple of experiences I had. One was flying into New York and having what I'd call these days anyway, run-of-the-mill security experience in terms of what they did. But it was very unpleasant. It's aggressive people, eyes bugging out at me, snapping at me, despite the fact I was there as a tourist. And then later I flew to Tel Aviv in Israel and had, even more so coming out than going in, the most stringent airport security beyond anything I have ever seen, including like a debriefing basically when I was trying to get out of the place. However, I didn't mind. I cannot say that the young man and young woman who what would any other circumstances would have amounted to an interrogation, they questioned me and they were so pleasant. The whole thing was done the best possible way, and it was just really stark contrast.
Yeah. So one extreme about that now is to examine intelligence in the sort of technical sense of the term of learning, and anyone who has helped a child get dressed to put their coat on. That's when you find out if they, for example, if they're sick, if they have a temperature. You find out if they took the cookie. Maybe they even took a knife. You learn things through helping people. You don't necessarily learn things from people about people by yelling at them. And so again, it's, I think, the American way of interrogation is to yell at people, and again, to have this militaristic command structure. The Israeli system is one which is well worked out as a conversational set of sequences in which the theory is that if they keep asking you questions, if you're not telling the truth, your stories will stop agreeing with one another. Law enforcement people around the world, some of them at least, know this. And so one reaction is to just engage people in continuous conversation, as we sometimes do with our friends or colleagues, and then we find the inconsistency in the story, and then we know that something is amiss and something is wrong, as opposed to the idea that you can scream at them, and that will cause them to obey. Or, in the extreme, we can torture them. And if you torture them, you'll get at the truth rather than if you chat with them. And the Israelis have a more of a chatty situation. I should add, however, embedded in a context in which there is really not too much respect for civil liberties. And so something that, like profiling people based on ethnicity or religion, race, or nation is part of the routine, as opposed to the U.S., where civil liberties are taken more seriously and block that blatant kind of profiling, although I think it goes on in the U.S. and probably in Britain as well.
Now, in the West, for the most part, we like to talk a lot about, free market and what have you, but we don't really see, have a free market in security, in the sense that it's maybe it's on private airports, but it would be difficult, for example, to set up an airport and say one of our USPs is going to be low-level security, basic security like we used to have in decades gone by, and then allow the market to decide whether people were willing to fly out of there knowing that the security was less stringent, or whether people would avoid it because, oh no, they don't do the body scans and the pat-downs, and they don't tear people's luggage apart there, so I'm not going to go there. It's just interesting to see what a free market security arena would look like.
Well, the whole security business helps us, I think, helps me to see the way markets meet the state, the way government meets up with markets, because there are unusual circumstances. So the scenario you just laid out would be very difficult to implement because of the fact that unless I know that you're doing very major security operations in Britain, unless I know that, I can't be sure you're not letting an airplane into the sky that is filled with terrorists, or really only one or two, who will guide that plane toward a target in my own country. So therefore, the governments of the world have to get into the act rather than just the corporations in the world. And that mix of government and corporation takes place in kind of a revealing way. I, for one, am quite sympathetic to government. But in the case of the security apparatus, what you see is the way the government interacts. So when I go to the airport and I check in, the people are reasonably nice to me. The friendly skies of United Airlines, they're reasonably nice to me, and often very nice, actually. And then when I get to the security gate, especially here in New York, then there's all this yelling and screaming and banging and yelling and all of that. And there I am with the government. Then I get through it again to the opposite side, and it is like leaving the Russian zone in the old Berlin and getting into the American or British or French zone. It's like freedom, and that's the way it is. But now I've entered the world of fast food franchises and airlines. The security apparatus imposes costs on us as we move through the system. It also imposes costs on the profit-making corporations because of the fact that their flights are delayed. People miss their flights. It imposes a cost, and there have been tensions between the airlines and the governments, at least in the U.S., about this, because the airlines are not in favor of these complicated systems of control that cost them business. And in the U.S., after September 11th, when they imposed these, it had an effect on increasing the number of car trips that people take on short hauls along the East Coast in particular, and also increase the use of train travel, which, as you probably know, in the U.S. is quite primitive. So the airlines lose by this, and so it gives us an opportunity to see the interaction of the market and the state, and it isn't the clear dichotomy that people are used to thinking of themselves on a sort of left-right, a socialist capitalist continuum. It looks a bit different.
Well, the airline's resistance to increasing airport security was a very big news item on this side of the Atlantic as well, particularly the last big blow up, I think, pardon the phrase, the last big upsurge of that was when they introduced the no liquids thing, and his name escapes me for the moment, but the arrogant blowhard boss of Ryanair out of Ireland actually said something I agreed with at the time for once, and he was very vocal against these increasing security measures. Richard Branson of Virgin was, as you'd expect, more eloquent on the subject. But yeah, not just to the airlines, of course, but across all of the business and attempted profit-making world, security is becoming extremely onerous.
Yeah, you see, a lot of it comes from also this idea we were talking before about we must do something. Another aspect of we must do something is that it's the only thing that matters. So in this country, one thing I've done is study the New York subway system and the security regimes that surround the New York subway system. And if somebody at a public hearing or whatever, or a politician says, well, it's a matter of security, then yes, we must do that. That ends discussion because security rules. There's no competing notions if someone just raises the issue of security. And that betrays the fact that every organization, just like every one of us in our lives, has multiple goals. And it can't be that the only thing that matters is security. But once you get that line going, then you shut off discussion of other alternatives. As well as, like, for example, we have to make a profit in the case of a corporation. Like the fact that we've got to serve children lunch in a school cafeteria. That there are many other goals simultaneous to security. People are learning. People are just trying to have a nice day. People are trying to get from place to place. People want to be sent off by their loved ones at the airport, and they want to be near them. They want to be greeted when they get off the plane, especially if they have certain problems, and know having an airline assistant help them is not the same thing as a family person helping them. All of these are important life goals that we all have, and to keep saying that, well, it's only security, and we know how security is to be done, and helping, for example, is not part of it. So it's a matter of seeing security in context, and that there are always other goals that you want to be pursuing.
Yes, well, I think that point that you touched on there, that it's difficult to speak out or take a contrary position on security matters, is very important. Because I mean, you've been able to speak, to give interviews, to write your book, and that's fine. You're free to do that. But often for people inside organisations, government, corporations, whatever, it's seen as like, it's almost like disloyal, or that it's somehow insane to question this, even though there might be a room, there might be a meeting taking place with however many people, and they all agree the opposite of what they're going to go ahead and implement, but no one can say anything.
Right, and we see it at the micro level. If you're, for example, as in New York, being greeted by police on the subway to inspect if you get caught in one of their inspections, which happens occasionally in the New York police, the New York police do it in the subway or at the airport. If you speak up, you're looking for trouble. And at the airport, if you are an opponent, you risk being detained. You, of course, risk much more than being detained if you also fit some other aspect of the profile. And so it silences you. And in the same way, you spoke of Branson speaking out in Britain against the apparatus. There's been no Branson within the United States. So at the corporate level, the big bosses of the airlines don't speak out against it, even though it's in their interests. And for me personally, when I saw this book taking shape, it did dawn on me, wow, I could be in trouble for this. I can report that the United States is not fascist, with an asterisk so far and in regard to me. And I've been able to come and go without concern. But the fact that it dawned on me, I think bespeaks a larger anxiety that people have about speaking out.
Well, somewhat tangential to the ability or otherwise to speak out is a kind of what I call the suspicion threshold, which is like what constitutes suspicious behaviour. And I know you address this in the book. So, for example, at an airport, running or raising your voice, or God forbid, doing both at the same time, it now constitutes a potential threat, or perhaps in the eyes of some security people, an actual threat. I was at an airport recently and a child's balloon popped, and a number of people almost jumped out of their skins. We really are afraid of our own shadow.
Yeah. And, life, I mean, the example of the pop balloon, I used to spend quite a bit of time at airport security watching, which is a little bit tricky because you don't want to become a suspicious person yourself. But using my cell phone video, I could take quite a bit of video. And life is crazy. Real life has lots of things that go off track, like a balloon bursting, like a child's toy getting loose from the child. Children are great because they engage in quasi-random moves and create a kind of randomness in the world, which drives parents crazy, of course, if you're trying to raise one. But it doesn't fit into things like a security apparatus at all, because the children are innocent. And so their toy will roll from one side of the security barrier to the other side of the security barrier, and they dart to get it. Because they're not impressed by either their parents or by the Transportation Security Agency in the U.S. And this sets off chaos, a minor chaos, because they've got to deal with this unscripted behavior that they don't know what to do with. And the world is full of unscripted behavior. So people make jokes of all kinds. They make jokes about bombs. They say to each other, we all do all the time, someone says, I'm going to eat your donut. You say, I'll kill you. Well, is that a threat? And well, yes, at the security gate, it might well be. And so this, use the term again, militaristic apparatus, which is oriented toward breaking people down into specific moves and imposing rules about how each move should be made, runs against the nature of life So it really is a kind of a system in which you've imposed, it's really an anti-life system. Life in the sense of the randomness, chaos, mirth, joking, innuendo making. All of this is impermissible against the effort to impose these tight structures of bureaucratic security.
One of the things that concerns me most going forward, looking at the bigger picture of this, and this is related to what I was saying a moment ago about people, they might want to run or raise their voice or maybe do both in the airport or somewhere similar, but they're sort of self-policing because they're concerned about drawing attention to themselves, is that we do seem to be breeding a sort of reflexive obedience in people that could really is, I think, potentially quite dangerous. I'm not trying to sound a conspiratorial note here, but it's sort of the net effect of this, not that anyone's trying to achieve this, but even more so than usual, waiting around to be ordered in one direction and pointed over there and corralled and controlled.
Well, that again is interesting because it's sort of the politics in the small p of how this works. I take a very dim view of security, but I notice some people, again, especially at the airports, they are happy to participate. I roll my eyes at the person next to me going through the line. They don't roll their eyes back. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they say they're glad to do their part. And I think, again, that's revealing that it's almost like an experiment that security sets up. How is it that people are going to react? And they react differently. Some people are very pleased to obey and eager to show their obedience. And some people roll their eyes but are quiet. I would say that's my stance. But other people are openly rebellious. And they risk getting in trouble.
Now, there's a number of other areas that you touch upon in the book, sort of with their own discrete chapters, one of which is related directly to 9/11, which we were speaking about earlier. And you have a chapter on basically the rebuilding efforts at Ground Zero in New York, and what should have been perhaps an opportunity for some reflection, thoughtfulness, maybe even some humility, has instead turned it into being about hubris, being about macho and about winning ultimately.
Yes. So these very things we've been talking about, the response with aggressiveness as opposed to with humility or thoughtfulness, I think plays out in buildings, and the reconstruction of the World Trade Center site displays hubris in construction and also fear and anxiety and what is done with that fear and anxiety. So as most people probably know, after September 11th, there were large forums about what should be done with the site and what do we do in concrete steel or in plant materials? What do we do at that place? And some people said there should be a meadow, reflective pool, recreational facilities. I wrote into the New York Times that the best antidote to terror is charm and wit. None of those played out, and instead there came to be the idea that we needed to do something bold that would show that the United States is not afraid, and that we can restore the grandeur of the New York skyline. Now, those buildings were never much liked by the architectural critics, or I don't think by very many other people, the original towers. So it was an opportunity, therefore, to create something equally big, at least, and but even better in terms of grandeur. And so the great architects of the world all participated in a competition as to whose building would win. And your Lord Norman Foster of Britain was one of the contenders, as well as, again, the great star architects of the world all participated. And one was chosen, there was a jury, a selection jury, that chose one particular firm. That was actually a consortia itself of important architectural firms of the world. And the governor of New York ruled against them. There were many permutations of the building that then got implemented. And the final version, in the final case, the project is not being done by one of the architects of the world at all, but being done by the very architect who had been hired before the attacks to do the remodel on the ground floor plaza and the retail on the lower levels. He is a competent but unimaginative architect, considered a kind of nuts and bolts architect, and that's who designed the building. But the real security part of the building is that the bottom 20 stories of the building will be nothing but concrete. That is, the space that would ordinarily be approximately 20 stories of office space, glass enclosed, will instead be nothing but dead concrete. And that's because the police at the last minute overruled the architect and the other officials who were involved, because they said, well, no, the site would be now accessible to a truck bomber who could do damage if the bottom 20 stories were the typical glass and steel for retail and office. So, in fact, the bottom 20 stories are absolutely nothing. The top, more than the equivalent of 20 stories, because they are such a beckoning target. This will be the tallest building. This will be the tallest structure, I correct myself, in North America. They're calling themselves the tallest building. It's not. It's the tallest structure, because there will be a spire atop the building, which is double the height of the Empire State's spire. And only by having this enormous spire does the building reach the height where they can say it is the highest building in North America, and that indeed it is 1,776 feet tall, to commemorate America and its Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And so it's got its patriotism built into the fabric of the building, and it's got its fear built into the fabric of the building. It's got its militarism built into the fabric of the building. And so it really is, in a way, a new kind of architecture. Not completely new, because fortresses, which our cities were built, many of them originally as fortresses in Europe, the fortress architecture has happened before. But the whole thrust of modern architecture, of glass and steel and transparency, was against the idea of fortress. And so now we're really back in the business of fortress. And it's, I think, another consequence of the security regime.
Speaking as a former would-be architect, I have to say that the last thing you needed on that site was another Eye of Sauron, but it appears to be roughly what you've got, because I've seen the pictures and it is truly horrible. You also have in the book a section on natural disasters, and specifically you drill down into the events before, during and after Hurricane Katrina. I don't know if there's any unique aspects of that you'd perhaps like to touch on.
Well, it's my effort. I did research in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, trying to figure out for myself how that occurred. And my research there involved interviews with many dozens of experts from hydrology and geology and urban planning and many other fields. And what one learns is that the effort to control the water, which has been going on for well over 100 years in the Gulf of Mexico area, and particularly in New Orleans, those efforts are to control are incriminated in what went wrong. And there's one particular canal that was built, arguably as a flood control canal, but also as a commercial canal, as a way of getting ships to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico in a more efficient and cost-effective way for the entrepreneurs involved in shipping. That is heavily a force. And so this canal, which locally is called Mr. Go, is locally called Hurricane Highway, because in the effort to build a way to get the ships to go out of the city, the heart of the city, and into the Gulf, to keep the floodwaters that are normal to New Orleans and to that region out of the city, they created this vertically walled channel through which, when the weather shifts, you have the mechanism through which a hurricane comes into the city. And that storm surge was key to the destruction of the city. So in this completely different genre, this completely different setting than the airports or 9/11 or the New York subways, you have another mechanism in which the need to do something and to secure the place against nature was the very vehicle that caused the whole place to be done in. And we have had a replay of that in a way with Hurricane Sandy here in the northeast of the United States, in which we learned that so many of the artifice mechanisms that were built including the very houses that people were living in, that were built along the water. It was human-made artificial elements that created the danger. And you, as someone who had been involved in architect, I'm sure know this, because now increasingly people are saying, and the lesson is taking hold now in New York, that what creates catastrophe is human beings. There are no natural disasters. There are only human beings who create disaster for themselves by the way they manipulate the physical environment. And that's what happened in New Orleans. And to a strong degree, that's what's happened in the Northeast here.
And of course, Katrina and the aftermath of that, and well, actually the lead up to it as well, was perhaps one of the ultimate examples of what we touched upon earlier. That is to say, corruption and profiteering, political corruption and business corruption, entering into the arena of security. In fact, just recently in the news headlines, it was reported, you may know more about this than me, officials, not sure it was the mayor, but certainly senior officials in New Orleans in the news again with regards to corruption.
Yes, and indeed it is the mayor. It's not just the mayor. Louisiana and New Orleans has a long tradition of heavy corruption, and the whole security apparatus just in effect got grafted onto that apparatus. That goes on all over the world, of course, as the United States and other countries, the great nations of Europe, as they used to be called, runs through these various other countries, thinking that we can just provide military support for our people, and we'll have control over what happens with the money, those arms, and those troops that we foster. And they become, in effect, wild to our goals and have all sorts of consequences. In New Orleans, to get back to what went on in Katrina, one of the reasons why there was so much death in Katrina and so incompetently handled was, again, the militarism. So if you create a situation in which the first responders that come in from the outside are the military, then you won't help people live. And that is what happened, by the way. There was great fear of looting and even of mass murder that supposedly was going on among the people of New Orleans, among the victims themselves. And so the great response of the U.S. government was troops on the ground and to beef up control at a time when people needed diapers and medicine, food and water. And that accelerated the death rate. Also, the services had been much weakened by the fact that the National Guard, for example, had been sent to Iraq, and that the units that would have otherwise been available were less available. That after 9/11, the aid to the government, local governments for security, went to things like flak vests and bomb detection and helicopters and remote sensing mechanisms, as opposed to, for example, flat-bottomed safety boats that could have hauled people out, which the local people had actually requested. So again, there's an intersection between the two kinds of security that you're trying to do. The security against terror, terror in the Middle East, but also crime that is supposedly going on. And it turns out to have been an utter fiction that people were killing each other. For example, in the Superdome, some people may remember the Superdome, which became enormously crowded and difficult, but it was orderly right all the way through. And so people couldn't get aid because the first forms of aid were military aid, which was no aid at all, and really didn't do any help.
Well, Harvey, as we bring things to a close for today, I'd just like to say, I mean, if you told me 20 years ago that we'd be being forced to do the sort of things we're forced to do now in airports, I'd have said, no, people won't buy that. To coin a phrase, that's not going to fly. People just won't accept that level of intrusive security. But here we are. And also that as each new security measure is implemented, there never seemed to be any getting rolled back to sort of balance it out. Even when the so-called need for it is debunked, it's kind of just kept in place. I mean, the liquid bomb thing has been pretty much comprehensively debunked in terms of what was actually doable in the air, but we're still all living with it. And it's part of that can't question the thing, I guess. You know, if you roll something back, then what are you admitting? You know, what are you giving away? And just what your thoughts on that are and how you feel about, you know, the future, where things are going with regard to security.
Yes. Well, first of all, some things were simple to do, and for relaxing people, if for no other reason, they were good to do. So locking the cabin of the pilot away from the cabin of the passengers accomplishes most of what there is to be accomplished, if anything, much at all. And that's a nice thing to do, because it interferes minimally in anyone's life. The pilot, if the pilot has to pee, he's got a problem. But other than that one individual with that one problem, and it can be overcome, there is very little intervention in people's lives. And compared to this mass mess that's created in the routines of all of our beings by these other kinds of measures. The other thing to keep in mind is that the kinds of events in which people were stopped from doing terror, in the airplanes, for example, but also in the New York subways, and we didn't talk much about that, but there are many instances, is people helping each other. And so it's other passengers or the flight attendants who have stopped crazy people on airplanes from blowing up the planes. There have only been a handful of such instances, but none of those people were stopped really by the security apparatus, the official security apparatus. It was stopped by ordinary passengers or by flight attendants who were trying to serve lunch, and they took care of that problem. It's people helping people. In terms of reversing any of the other stuff, once there's an inertia to all of this, and the problems of silence, and that you could be a traitor, lack patriotism, or be irresponsible, all of that keeps everything on track. However, a ray of light. In the U.S., in the last few days, the government has announced a retreat on what we call full body scans. I don't know if you have them yet in Britain. The machines where that renders your body transparent. It's not just a metal detector. They're horrible, actually, because you have to raise your arms above your head, and a photo is taken that is really quite revealing of your private parts. And all of this is in response to the so-called underwear bomber. because we saw that people could put things in their underwear. Of course, people can also put things up their anal canals, and people have done that, but we have no way of dealing with that. Anyway, these full body scans are going to be taken away because the contractor has not been able to devise a technology that secures what is regarded as the proper privacy of members of the flying public. And so we actually have a reversal. And that's one of the few reversals. There have been a few others that have taken place. And so there's a ray of hope for you.
Well, that is news, actually. I wasn't aware of that. So I'll look into that for sure, find out what's going on. But that's very hopeful. Harvey, your book, once again, for listeners, Against Security, How We Go Wrong at Airports, Subways, and Other Sites of Ambiguous Danger. That's available pretty much everywhere. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your work, where people can find out about it? Do you have a website, for example?
No, I don't. But they can find out about it by going to that book on the web. It'll be easy to find, and it tells about the contents of the book.
Wonderful. Well, Harvey, thank you very much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for another week. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com. You can spell legalize with an S or a Z. There you'll find an archive of programs on many equally fascinating topics. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.